And I'm really excited today to talk about D. Michael Quinn's work because D. Michael Quinn has been such an important part of our community. And but before that, as a step towards honoring sort of the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation as Sunstone, which is a predominantly religious and Mormon space that has a history of colonization, we want to do a land acknowledgement. Sunstone and Utah Humanities has tried to commit that all of our public gatherings and meetings will have a traditional acknowledgement statement about Native lands. And so we want to do that and put our money where our mouth is and try to embody a commitment to Indigenous rights and cultural equity. For more than 500 years, Native communities across the Americas have demonstrated resilience and resistance in the face of violent efforts to separate them from their land, culture, and each other. They remain at the forefront of movements to protect Mother Earth and the life it sustains. Today, corporate greed and federal policy push agendas to extract wealth from the earth, degrading sacred land in blatant disregard of treaty rights. Acknowledgement is a critical public intervention, a necessary step toward honoring Native communities and enacting the much larger project of decolonization and reconciliation. And so because of this, we'd like to recognize that even though it's a virtual event, it's kind of a strange thing to do, the area of land that most of Utah Humanities and Sunstone sits on were first used by nomadic bands of Ute, Paiute, Shoshone, Bannock Indians who roamed along the base of the mountains as they traveled from their winter home at Utah Lake to summer fishing grounds at Bear Lake and down into southern Utah. And I just want to recognize that I am sitting on Navajo and Paiute land. And so it's just part of our commitment to do that. And we invite everyone out there to be more mindful of the land and our responsibility and relationship to it. So as we move forward, we're going to talk about Mike Quinn's work today. Like I said, Mike Quinn is a huge part of Sunstone. Many of you know that he passed away earlier this last year, and it's been kind of a big deal for all of us in Mormon studies because he's not only been such a interesting and wonderful person to know in real life. A lot of us have relationships with him, but his work has done wonders for Mormon history. You can't encounter Mormon history without knowing about Mike Quinn or knowing about his work. And if you're unfamiliar with it, if this is your first time becoming acquainted with Mike Quinn's work, congratulations. I'm really excited for you. It's going to be a journey. And that's why today we're going to talk about some of his most controversial work. And I'll let the scholars that we have on talk more about this because the history of his work is almost as interesting as the text itself and the research that he's done. So today we're going to have Ben is going to do Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, which is a phenomenal book. And then Katie is going to do the Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power, which is part of a whole series of Mormon hierarchy books that are really phenomenal and worth checking out. And then Carrie is going to do one of my favorite books, The Same-Sex Dynamics Among 19th-Century Americans, a Mormon Example. And I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. And I just want to say today is Ben Park's birthday. And so if you want to honor Ben Park on his birthday, you should go buy his book. He's got a book, Kingdom of Nauvoo, out. And so what better way to say happy birthday to a scholar than to buy their book? So go do that if you haven't done it already. And I'll just tell you about his conference. And then Ben is also organizing a conference about the life and work of Mike Quinn, which is really exciting. It's going to be, I believe, March 25th, 2022, University of Utah. D. Michael Quinn, The Life and Times of a Mormon Historian. And Ben's organizing this entire conference about Mike Quinn's work. It's going to be brilliant. So you can watch Ben Park's Twitter, Facebook, even my Facebook for more information. We'll keep you up to date on how you can register and get involved. But let's start with Ben. Benjamin E. Park received his PhD from the University of Cambridge and is an assistant professor of history at Sam Houston State University. He is the co-editor of Mormon Studies Review, editor of Blackwell's A Companion to American Religious History, and author of Kingdom of Nauvoo, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Empire on the American Frontier. Go buy it. Which received the Best Book Award for the Mormon History Association. And then our second panelist, Katie Ludlow Rich, is a writer and independent scholar living in Saratoga Springs, Utah, with her husband, 4 children, and 2 dogs. She has a bachelor's in history and a master's in English, both from Brigham Young University. She is the blog feature editor for the Exponent 2 magazine and blogs monthly at theexponent.com. She presented at the Mormon History Association conference for the first time in 2021, and it was so good. Her research interests include 19th and 20th century Mormon women's history, theological developments regarding Heavenly Mother, and gender-based power dynamics in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm telling you, she's a scholar to watch. Her stuff is really innovative and brilliant. Her ideas are great. And then Dr. Carrie Prey, I'm so excited that she's coming onto this because she's brilliant. I've respected her work for a long time. She teaches scientific communication at Stevenson's University. She co-edited a book of essays from queer Mormons called I Spoke to You with Silence that is coming out in spring of 2022 with the University of Utah Press. So everybody watch for that. It's going to be great. Carrie lives in Maryland with her wife, 2 children, and their father. And so with that, we're going to get started. What we're going to do is have each scholar is going to take about 15-20 minutes to talk about their book assignment, and we're going to let them talk through. You're welcome to put questions in our Q&A, and then after everyone has given their little presentation, we're going to take as many questions as we can. So with that big introduction, let's take it over to you, Ben.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Lindsay for inviting me and for Sunstone for sponsoring this event. I also want to thank Willie and Utah Humanities for putting this on. I also want to add my echo to the land acknowledgement and add I'm speaking from the ancestral homes of the Badai tribes, among others, here in Huntsville, Texas. I'd like to start my remarks with 2 statements. The first one is factual, albeit somewhat surprising, and the second is meant to be more provocative. First, the odd but true statement. Though we view the work of early Mormonism and the magic worldview as the work of a seasoned and distinguished scholar, it was the first edition of the book was actually Quinn's first self-chosen monograph. It was also the last monograph he wrote as an employed professor. 2 qualifications on that statement. First, he had obviously already written a book by that point, the first edition of his biography of J. Reuben Clark, The Public Years, that was published by BYU Press as one in a series of biographies on Clark. And the second qualification is that, like most of his works, like Mormon Hierarchy, he had been researching on those projects during these eras, even if they weren't turning into monographs until much later. But I want to emphasize, by this point that Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview appeared in 1987, D. Michael Quinn was known for his articles. Most notably, he was known for his article on Post-Manifesto Plural Marriages, an article that I still believe is his most influential contribution, both in terms of scholarly analysis as well as his own personal narrative. But that's another topic. So when you look at early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, it was actually his first attempt at the scholarly genre of monograph on a topic that he himself chose. And we can see key features of his research, analysis, and argument philosophies. We also see how those approaches evolve. If you look at the first edition of Early Mormonism Magic Worldview and compare it to his later books that came out in the 1990s, there's quite a few differences, which I'm going to highlight in a second. All right, now I'm coming to the second statement, the provocative one. That is that the most commonly read version of Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, this paperback version, is more significant, I'd argue, for what it reveals about 1990s Mormonism than it does about early Mormonism. But wait, you tell me, early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview wasn't even published in the 90s. It was published in 1987. But we're actually talking about 2 separate books here. The first edition, published in 1987, was a straightforward scholarly monograph that totaled 313 pages. The second edition, published 11 years later in 1998, had swelled to 646 pages. And it is in that swelling, those extensive additions to the main text, as well as the numerous additions to the endnotes, I'd argue, that we have a time capsule of the Mormon intelligentsia wars of the 1990s. But more on that at the end. Let me give a little background to the book itself. If you would have told D. Michael Quinn in 1980 that within 7 years he would be publishing a book on the decade before the founding of the church, the 1820s, he probably would have laughed at you. While his scholarly research was broad, in fact, I think there are few figures in the field of Mormon history whose scholarly depth covers as much chronology as D. Michael Quinn, a lot of his work covered the later 19th century and early 20th century, at least a lot of his publications at this time. As an example of where his diverse interests were, in 1977, shortly after he was hired as a history professor at Brigham Young University, he was invited to go meet with Eldridge Smith. Eldridge Smith was a former church patriarch, a descendant of Hiram Smith and the custodian of the Smith family heirlooms. And he was invited to Smith home as a new historian specializing on Mormonism to look at all these material. And among the material that Eldridge Smith was trying to show to D. Michael Quinn were the magic parchment documents that later become a crucial book. And Quinn later remembers in his memoirs, he says, when I was presented with those documents, I didn't think that they were important at all. And I kept on saying, I'm not interested in this stuff. I'm interested in this other stuff instead. And it wasn't until later that he realized how important it was. It was shortly after that point that he was commissioned to write the public years version of the J. Reuben Clark biography, that he then became obsessed with Post-Manifesto Polygamy and then continued his work on Mormon hierarchy. It wasn't until the Mark Hoffman saga that pulled his interest earlier. I mean, there are lots of consequences that came out of the Hoffman saga, a saga that captured the national attention with the Netflix documentary series earlier this year. But one of the consequences of that era was it pulled a number of scholars who were working on later periods of Mormonism to early Mormonism to understand all these new documents that are coming out about magic, most notably D. Michael Quinn and Ronald Walker. And while Quinn was not among the scholars who were part of a big and legendary issue of BYU Studies that came out in 1984 to reckon with Joseph Smith and magic in the early period. His attention came a bit later, and ironically, it wasn't until Mark Hoffman was arrested and the forgery started unraveling that he became interested in the magic world. It was a 1985 memo sent by none other than the church education system to church employees stating that even if Hoffman's documents proved fraudulent, there was still quote unquote ample evidence that existed for Joseph Smith's treasure seeking. And when he read that phrase, Quinn believed that it was now his job to go find that ample evidence and see what it means. And so he went to work starting in 1985. So starting the project in 1985 and finishing in 1987, that's a quick turnaround, which kind of shows when Quinn turned his focus on something, he could churn out scholarship at a quick rate. A lot changes in those 2 years, ironically, and in some ways to the detriment of the field. First, the Hoffman explosions and the discovery of the fraud escalated the wars between the apologists on the one hand and the critics on the other, which made the battles over Mormon tradition and Mormon heritage all the more fraught, which meant that his work was now going to be received in a much more chaotic or angry culture. Second, Quinn's work on Post-Manifesto Polygamy, which came out in 1985, had put him in some hot water, and his position at BYU became increasingly tenuous. As I'm sure many of you are aware, and those who aren't, I recommend reading the works on Quinn that narrate this part of his life. At one point, his stake president was directed by church leaders to revoke his temple recommend, which would in turn make him lose his job because you have to maintain ecclesiastical standing to work at BYU. There was a workaround and he was able to avoid the crisis at that moment, but he knew his time was short. It was also at this time that his department chair had urged him to resign, in part due to his controversial scholarship, and in part due to he was now divorced and he was exploring his homosexuality, and he was even followed by spies into some gay bars in Salt Lake. And so let's just say that his position at BYU was becoming a bit perilous. Finally, he finished a full manuscript, a draft of the manuscript, sent it off to Signature Books, who he decided to be the publisher. And Signature Books, doing their duty as a reputable press, sent the manuscript out for peer review. And the person they sent it for peer review was none other than Davis Bitton. Now, Davis Bitton was a professor of history at the University of Utah, who had also been an assistant historian of the church to Leonard Arrington during the 1970s. Bitton was also Quinn's mentor. He was his graduate advisor when Quinn got his master's degree at the U during the 70s. But Bitton, by this time, had been becoming more conservative and had been worried by the growing culture wars, and this new context was making Quinn's work on magic seem all the more dangerous. And so Bitton wrote in his manuscript report back to Signature, urging Quinn to drop the project. And he said, if Quinn refuses to drop the project, Signature should refuse to publish the project. And if Signature refuses, and if Signature doesn't go along with that, then I don't want my name associated with the project at all. I don't even want my name mentioned in the acknowledgments. This review actually drove Mike Quinn into a bout of depression for several weeks, because now his big idol was turning against him. But he still turned in the manuscript. It was published in the fall of 1987, which turned out to be Quinn's last year as a history professor at BYU, as he was forced to resign that spring. In fact, it was his last day on BYU campus that he packed up his office, drove up to Logan, Utah, where the Mormon History Association was going to meet, and he received the Best Book Award. So let's talk about very quickly some of the key arguments in the book. While I'm holding up the second edition, just in your mind picture that I'm holding up the first edition of the book. The first edition of the book was very different than this one. It was much more svelte. It was much more focused. It was also a bit more tepid in its conclusions. The major argument, although I'll note in a minute, one of the flaws of the book is it didn't have a clear, succinct thesis. The major argument was that more religion and magic interlaced in ways in the 1820s that Mormonism moved away from decades after, although the legacies of it remained quite long. And in a fascinating turn that Quinn takes in approaching this work is he's pretty upfront about framing his work as apologetic, meaning that he believes that you can understand these topics without it being detrimental to one's faith in the church. He argued that you can still see Joseph Smith as a prophet while acknowledging that he participated in treasure digging, that he used seer stones and divining rods and carried around amulets and talismans and all these other things. So he even said that it was a historian's duty when approaching these types of metaphysical stories to state where one stands on those topics. And so one of the last paragraphs in the introduction of the book, he bears his testimony, which is an odd thing to do in an academic text, but it reveals the mindset he's coming from as well as the community that he expects to receive it. Now, the scope of the book is both broad and remarkably narrow. There are 7 chapters. The first chapter is a sweeping multi-century overview of religion and magic, where it basically tries to survey the field and talk about all the examples that historians have brought up of how magic and religion have interlaced, and even the concept of religion and magic have evolved over the time and had changed to the point to where we are today, where we now see those as 2 separate things, where back in early America, they were seen as together. That introductory chapter is then followed by 4 chapters that are thematic and all focus on the 1820s, which is kind of remarkable to think about. Of this entire book, more than half of it is focused on the period between Joseph Smith's alleged visitation from the angel Moroni and the organization of the church. It focuses on divining rods, treasure digging, seer stones, ritual magic, astrology, amulets, talismans, magic parchments, occult meteors, and the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. It then has a chapter on one chapter on kind of the Joseph Smith's leadership of the church from 1830 to 1844, and then one chapter that kind of talks about the legacies going forward. Now, the work in the manuscript is quite uneven. Quinn is at his best when he's drawing from, these rich archival sources that he had been familiar with for decades now, especially the sources that he had previously found uninteresting in Eldridge Smith's Smith family connection. In fact, I think that the chapter on the parchments and the talismans that Joseph Smith carries around his Jupiter talisman until his death teasing out what that means culturally are some of the strongest parts of the books. There are other parts that are a bit more stretched when he's teasing out all these occultic documents and books that are published and just so happen to be, found in a library or bookstore down the road from Joseph Smith. And in fact, one of the critiques that many historians leveled at Quinn that I find quite viable is the argument that Quinn is trying to grant more coherence to these religious and magic beliefs that there really are. Saying that if Joseph Smith carried this Jupiter talisman, he believed all these other mythic ideas or traditions that have at some point been attached to the talisman, that he must have believed in all of those things, where most early Americanists, just like Americanists today, if they participate in one aspect of a sub-counterculture, that doesn't mean they embrace all the aspects of that counterculture. Another issue with the book is this book is famous for its voluminous bibliographic endnotes for lots and lots of text, which is meant to show, this overwhelming evidence. Well, when you start digging into that evidence, you realize that it's often a mile wide and kind of an inch deep, that there's evidence there. But by trying to trace everything so broad, he often places too much significance on one topic over another. So the reception of the book, and I promise I'm going to tie this up soon because I don't want to take up more time than I'm allotted, because I'm really excited to see what Katie and Carrie have to say. The reception of the book was quite divided. On the one hand, you have the non-Mormon Academy, who really enjoyed the book, but were also quite befuddled by it. If you read through all the scholarly reviews of Magic Worldview that were published in non-Mormon venues, they would often talk about praising Quinn for the breadth and the depth of his research, but then say, we found it odd that he feels he needs to express his testimony in these things, that he's inserting his own religious beliefs rather than dissecting the historical artifacts. And that was a pretty common thing across the reviews. So that's the scholarly reception. And then you had the Mormon reception, which was basically an all-out assault. Davis Bitton, when he urged Quinn to drop the project, that was a good prediction of how most Latter-day Saints were going to receive it. There was almost a cottage industry of critical reviews, of apologists, of what Quinn later calls polemicists, denouncing the book, denouncing its arguments as if it was striking at the core of Mormon doctrine and Mormon practice, which just goes to show where the society was at the time. After the book was released in 1987, it sold rather well, and Signature approached Quinn about doing a second printing, but Quinn actually told them to hold off on a second printing until he could update it and revise it. That meant that the book very quickly went out of print, and it very quickly became quite rare. At one point, Quinn admitted that he didn't even have a copy of the first printing anymore because he had given it away and there were no copies for sale. If you were today wanting to go buy a hard copy of the first edition of Magic Worldview, it's going for a meager rate of $900 on Amazon, in case you're interested. It wasn't until 11 years later that the second edition finally came out. And a lot changed in those years. In fact, a lot changed in the years immediately following the publication. Quinn was forced to resign from BYU within months of the book appearing. Then he spent several years trying to dodge church discipline by frequent moves and never having a permanent address. And then finally, when he settled in Salt Lake City, was excommunicated in September 1993. But rather than silencing him, of course, his excommunication led to his most productive publication period with a series of books that two of which Carrie and Katie are about to talk about in a bit. And it wasn't until 1997 that Quinn decided to return to Magic Worldview, spent 18 months revising and adding to it, and then it appeared in fall of 1998. The result of this, I argue, is basically two books squished in one. If you take the second edition, the paperback of Magic Worldview, you have within it the core of the first book, the arguments that he first made about magic and Mormon culture. And then you have the expanded version. These expanded expansions that are both found in the main text as well as in the footnotes fall into two categories. First, those about magic and religion, because there was a boom of scholarship that followed the publication of Magic Worldview, with lots of scholars talking about how religion and magic interlaced in the early republic. Quinn does not really engage this new scholarship so much as cite them as evidence that he was right all along. The second strain of revisions and expansions were his responses to critics, especially those responses to what he said, to what he called the polemicists, those who were critiquing him and calling his dignity and honesty into question. This led to some quite legendary footnotes, including my favorite, a 5-page long endnote responding to, of all things, John Welch's scholarship on Book of Mormon chiasmus. So just to give you an example, the wide-ranging topics that he is trying to deal with. As a result, this revised version, there are as many citations to farms as there are to early Mormon documents, which is why I argue that this book is a time capsule of these important historical and ideological debates of Mormonism in the 1990s. All right, just 2 minutes and then I'll close on the legacies of this book. As I mentioned, Quinn was not the only person working on religion and magic in the early republic. There were several scholars outside the Mormon world, not just spurred by Hoffman's documents, but spurred by a historiographical question about how magic interlaced with religion. And notably, a lot of these books, even though Quinn's book came out first, a lot of these other books deal with the topics perhaps in a bit more engaged and contextual and sophisticated way. For instance, John Butler's Awash in a Sea of Faith, which was published a few years later, is a more sophisticated and efficient treatment of popular religion, and he touches on Mormonism. Alan Taylor, one of the most famous historians of early America, wrote a series of really important articles that connect early Mormon magic culture to New England and the New York culture. And then finally, John Brooke wrote his book Refiner's Fire, published in 1992, I believe, that won the Bancroft Prize and is often seen as the more rigorous engagement with Mormonism in the occult. So while Magic Worldview is one of Quinn's most famous books, it's probably the book that doesn't age the best historiographically speaking. Of all of Quinn's monographs, it probably is the least influential on current scholarly thought. However, and this is a big however, the revised version is as influential as ever in the cultural realm, because as I mentioned, it captures all these important debates over the modern Mormon mind during the 1990s. The revised edition was a venue through which Quinn could vent his decade of alienation, a chance to settle scores, and an opportunity to set the record straight. The revised edition of early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, then, is part monograph and part autobiography. It is, however, to its core, all Quinn. Thanks.
All right, I'm not finding the present button, but it's on here somewhere. But let's talk about this book here, Same-Sex Dynamics in the 19th Century. So some of the basics for this book: it was published in 1996. It was rejected by Signature Books. So Signature Books had published a lot of Quinn's work, and then they decided this was too much. They couldn't do it anymore, and they were not going to go there. There was a lot of drama going on at this particular point in time with legal things, and so there was a lot there. So University of Illinois picked this up, and the book release came at about the same time that there was a couple of things happening. One, Utah became the first state to formally legally disavow any sort of same-sex marriage that had been performed in another state. And it also passed a law saying that high schools were not allowed to have gay clubs. So these things were in the news. There was a big media storm at the time. And the press was like, okay, we're going to do a big run for an academic book, 5,000 books. And they then had to revoke it right before it went out to press because the family of one of the people who was mentioned in the book, named Evan, we'll talk about in a little bit, caused a copyright scandal because they revoked the right to have the pictures published. And so they had to come up with a new cover for the book, like literally right before it was meant to go to press. They took 5,000 copies off of the press, later re-released the book with 10,000 copies, which all sold. So it was 10,000 copies is a lot for an academic book. So my wife is telling me hit the slideshow on the PowerPoint. I know, but see, here's the thing about Zoom is it crashes it sometimes. So we leave it like not like this. So anyway, sorry. Queer historical study is incredibly fraught. And this is a problem when it comes to all historical study. And this is something that Quinn notes in the very beginning of the book in some detail. So one of the problems of queer historical study is that records don't exist. They're hidden, they're written in code, they're destroyed. People don't want to talk about their queer relatives. They want to pretend like these things didn't mean the things that they clearly meant. Another problem is that queer is incredibly subjective. It's defined by whatever is normal in any given time. It's by definition the other, the abnormal. And so whatever is abnormal, that's the queer thing. And yet what is normal changes from one period of time to another period of time. So modern queerphobia is actually probably the biggest problem when it comes to any sort of queer historical study. It's not that we have to overcome the coding. It's not that we have to overcome any of these looking at these lenses that change from time to time. It's that our own queerphobia is very hard to see. And because it's very hard to see, it is hard to overcome. So one of the huge points of Quinn's book is that the 19th century included a wide normalized range of things that we would call queer, but they're not in the 19th century defined as queer. And a lot of this is because the 19th century does something that we don't do, or rather we do something that they don't do, which is we have defined entire fields of relationship by sex acts. We've said there are homosexual people, there are heterosexual people, as if these are identities, as if we can say, I am defined by the fact that I have this kind of sexual relationship. Where in the 19th century, a relationship or friendship or our love for somebody was not going to be defined by who is touching whose genitals at any given point in time. It's going to be defined by a much wider field of criteria. And so because of this fact, we're looking at a lot of things in the 19th century that we see as queer, that they didn't see as queer. So you could walk down the street holding hands with somebody who is of the same gender. You could cross-dress. You could do same-sex dancing. You could share somebody's bed. You could kiss them on the mouth. You could talk about how they were the love of your life, that they meant more to you than any person on earth, that their love to you was beyond any sort of traditional love. You could cuddle them. You could cuddle them in their bed. You could cuddle them all night long and wake up together. You could hold each other all night long and have this be normal. You could commit your life to be with somebody. You could publish in the Friend magazine and say you are committed to this woman and she is your partner for your entire life. And you could say that because this is the 19th century and this is not queer to say this. You could do all of these kinds of things. So when we're looking at this kind of relationship, which is different in the 19th century, we're looking at a range of terms that we have now defined as, say, homosexual. So now we say if you're in a homosexual relationship, you might marry somebody, you might live with somebody, you might hold their hand, and these things are all queer, but Quinn says these are not queer. And so he goes into different aspects: the homocultural, the homo-environmental, the homo-emotional, the homo-romantic, the homo-social, tactile, pastoral, marital, and then finally homoerotic, which is the one that we have somehow chosen to define every bit of our relationship by now. And this is at the core of both the reception of this book that is the problem, and also our own difficulty in ingesting what he's trying to say with it, is that we can't stop making queerness about genitals or about sex. This is the problem. We can't stop saying that, like, my relationship is defined by whose genitals are touching whose. This is really a ridiculous way to define relationships. And I think this is one of the fundamental points of Quinn's book. And we see in some of the criticism that comes out with this book that this is at the core of why people can't accept the book. So there was a person in the book, Evan Stevens, and this was the person whose relatives objected so strenuously to him being in the book that it caused the copyright scandal that made the book get revoked. And he was a composer. He wrote a lot of the hymns that are in the Mormon hymn book. He was also the director of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir for quite a period of time. He spent most of his life openly writing about the love that he had for men. He lived with a series of singers who were all male, one after the other. He never married a woman. And at one point in his life, he quit being the conductor of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And he went and moved with someone who was called a blonde Viking, who was a specimen, a superb specimen of manhood. He went off to form a life with him in New York City. And his relatives objected and said, "You have made this sound as if it is something that is gay. And we object to this. We object to this. There is no evidence that they, quote, acted on it." Even this question, did you act on it, is such a modern question that it's hard to describe. If you were going to ask somebody who is queer, what is it like to be in a gay relationship? What is it like to be in a homosexual marriage? If I'm going to talk about what it is like to be married, the things that I'm going to talk about are my life, my love, my devotion, the choices that I've made, what it's like, who I want to sit next to me in a hospital, what do I want to do, how do I want to raise children, how am I going to figure out the mortgage on my house, who am I going to go to the movies with? These are the questions that make up the day-to-day act of being in a queer relationship. But the modern view says we have to define this by, did you act on it? Did you act on it? And what does that unpack that? I mean, think about what it means for a heterosexual marriage to say, okay, you live together and you have a house and you have children and you talk to each other at night, and sometimes you may talk to each other on the phone, and sometimes you may make choices about where you're going to live and what you're going to do. But did you touch the other person's genitals? And this is the crux. And when we're trying to understand the 19th century versus our time, we're looking at the difference, Quinn says, between a world that does not define individuals by sex acts. You have relationships that are loving relationships. And the question of, did you act on it, is not a question fundamentally that even matters. It's a nonsensical question. The term homosexual itself isn't even invented for quite a long period of time. It's not invented actually until 1892, the same time that the idea of heterosexuality is invented. This is the very end of the 19th century. And this is the point at which there are a lot of changes that start to come in the church, that start to come in our interpretation of relationships, that start to come in our ability to see and understand what does it mean to have a same-sex relationship. One of Quinn's arguments in this book is that Mormons are really not that different. We like to think Mormons are peculiar and they're strange and they live a life that is strange, but in some ways they're very much not that different from modern America. The 19th century is one of extreme sort of homocultural friendship. This was a very normalized time, a normalized way to express love between the same sex. And Mormons were no different than anything else. And in some ways, in fact, they were less opposed. They were more tolerant of even the homoerotic aspects, some of the punishments that existed for, say, sodomy, were quite lenient. And Quinn goes into some detail about this. There's a whole chapter about legal aspects that existed that were different. And so we can look at Mormons, because Mormons are obsessive record keepers. We're many things, but one of the things we are is obsessive record keepers. And because we're obsessive record keepers, we have a lot of letters. We have a lot of things that we can look at that show this. So here's some of my favorite quotes from the book. I'm just going to go through a couple of them. One, we have the very straight sounding quote from Brigham Young that says, "There are few men in the world who care less about the private society of women than I do." That's something all straight guys say. This was a quote too. Joseph Smith was talking about the morning of the resurrection. And he says that his idea of the beautiful thing that will happen is, if you are with your very friend, you should lie down in the same bed and lock in each other's embrace, talking of your love, and you wake in the morning together. That was a very good quote there. I liked this one. There was a dispute that happened between two of the apostles. And when they finally reconciled it, he leaned over, he kissed me, he cried, they returned the kiss, they on the full-on mouth, this is how we kiss and we reconcile. I mean, one of my favorite parts of this particular quote was just imagining this happening with modern prophets, because that could be fun. We also have our two delightful, probably lesbians from the 19th century. This is May, and the friend called them ardent lovers. They talked about crawling into bed together at the end of the night. One of them had a polygamous husband. She never lived with him. And the other one moved in with her when her polygamous husband died, and they lived and worked together their entire lives. They had a devoted marriage for much of their years. And we can say that they were friends. They called themselves lovers, but we can call them friends, sure. This was also a pretty fun. One of the things that's so interesting about Quinn's work is that there are a million tiny details that you can miss if you are not paying attention. And so this was when I was reading about the same-sex ceremonies in Mormonism. You used to be able to be sealed to somebody of the same sex in the temple, and you would promise over the altar that you would be friends forever and ever. And I was so emotional when I read this. I thought that was so beautiful. I tweeted about it. And all of my Twitter followers said, okay, but listen, you didn't read the next paragraph. And the next paragraph talks about, and this is the line right here, Thompson professed great friendship for him, but he gave away to temptation and he had to die. This is what Joseph Smith says about the person that he jokes about being married to, this man. And I don't know what that means. It's just very provocative. And this is the most common thing that we see in Quinn's book. It's so packed. There are so many things that are in it that you can miss a lot of them. When it comes to the criticism, this book was not widely, I wouldn't say it was widely criticized. The people at BYU, the people of the church, people at farms in particular, were very upset by this book for a lot of reasons. And this was one of my favorite criticisms that I read of this book, that said he has massed such a staggering amount of evidence. It's like he wants to force us to agree with him. How dare he? How dare he amass so much evidence and so many notes that we have to agree with him? That was great. This particular review, there's a link that I have. I don't know if the link will be available in the slides, but this should be Googled. It's perfect. It's the most beautiful review I've ever read. It's terrible, but it's fascinating for a lot of reasons. One, it talks about the former Mormon historian, now turned homosexual apologist, which is goals. Frankly, I'm not a historian and I don't claim to be a historian, but I would like to be a homosexual apologist. That would be awesome. And it goes into a lot of very scathing remarks. And a lot of these remarks can be boiled down to that question of, did they act on it? There is no evidence that they touched each other's genitals. And there's not much to say about that particular criticism, because no, there's not evidence. And I don't think that Quinn claims that there is. But I think that what he does claim is the thing that a lot of these critics miss, which is that really doesn't matter. It is besides the point. It's something that is a nonsensical argument to make. So here's some of the less fraught criticism people said. A lot of the people say that there are a lot of footnotes in this book, and it's true. Like literally, like half of this book, here's this book, is footnotes. Just so many footnotes, so much of it. It can be a little bit overwhelming when you read it. There's just massive amounts of it. Another criticism that was pretty valid, if understandable, is that he focuses more on the main people of power and less on the individual normal people. I think that there might be some misunderstanding that I don't think people understand the degree to which that early Mormons would revere their prophets and people of power. And so focusing on the prophets does actually focus on the people, but that was a criticism. This was one of my favorite criticisms right here, though. If the picture of the male dancing had appeared on the front page, everybody would buy it. That was excellent. We could look at that picture right here, actually. See that run right there? See if we can open it. Well, that's the one. Anyway, that was Michael Quinn's book.
Thank you so much, Carrie. We're gonna try Katie again. Katie, do you want to hop on and let's see how that works?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for your patience. I've had some technical difficulties. I've switched devices, and I'm hoping that if I just like skip the PowerPoint and just talk to you here, that it'll work better. Okay, so I was talking about the Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power, which was published in 1994. And it is a great book about issues on priesthood restoration, development of priesthood quorums, theocratic developments, and the succession crisis. And I want to look first at one example that highlights the way that Quinn entered conversations on significant touch points in Mormon history and forced a conversation to the forefront that challenged traditional understandings. So early on in Origins of Power, Quinn sets out to complicate the too simple traditional narrative of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood. The main issue for him is the timing of when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery received an angelic visitation from Peter, James, and John on the banks of the Susquehanna River to ordain them to the higher priesthood. And examining the records of priesthood restoration is complicated in part because the early published versions of the August 1830 revelation, now known as Doctrine and Covenants 27, didn't contain any references to John the Baptist, nor any references to visitation from Peter, James, and John. And these later additions to the revelation can't be found in any document before 1835, and similar concepts can't be found prior to 1834. So dating the event requires a triangulation of various sources, some of which were recorded up to 5 decades after the event. And according to Quinn's calculations, the morning of July 6, 1830, 3 months after the church was organized, is the likely date of the Melchizedek priesthood restoration. Quinn identifies historian Richard Bushman as the first Mormon historian to acknowledge the account suggesting a July 1830 date, but says that Bushman does not discuss the significance of the date. Quinn takes that next step and states that Mormon historians have been unwilling to challenge official history or to admit that Smith organized the LDS Church in April 1830 without the Melchizedek priesthood. And Quinn stakes a strong claim, but his claim was not left unchallenged. And I want to look at just a couple examples of responses to Quinn's claims here. So without naming Quinn, Larry C. Porter, a BYU professor of church history and doctrine, responded with an article in the December 1996 Ensign, where he argued that while the precise date of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood is not known, it is likely between May 16th through 28, 1829, 11 months before the organization of the church. Porter argues that this timing is essential for Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to have had the priesthood keys necessary to restore the church on April 6, 1830. And Richard Bushman, having been specifically called out by Quinn, addresses the issue again in his 2005 landmark biography, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. In a footnote, Bushman responds specifically to Porter's Ensign article by saying that without additional information, the precise date of the visit of Peter, James, and John cannot be known. However, In the narrative text of his book, Bushman again presents the summer of 1830 as the likely timeframe for the apostolic visitation. And this isn't a new position for Bushman, but because of Quinn and Porter, Bushman had to specifically respond to the anxieties around a summer 1830 date. And there are, of course, many other scholars who have engaged in the debate on the date of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood. But Porter and Bushman's response to Quinn highlight how truth claims end up being fought inch by inch on the pages of Mormon history. So this issue is a prime example of why Quinn included such extensive footnotes. Origins of Power has 263 pages of detailed narrative, and then an impressive and overwhelming 395 pages of notes and appendices. And his exhaustive documentation makes him a heavy hitter, while at the same time leading some reviewers of Origins of Power to argue that he played too much inside baseball, too much just speaking to the concerns of other Mormon scholars. So the criticism isn't entirely unfounded. He writes with an insider perspective and frequently addresses narratives set forth by LDS publications. Quinn, however, was acutely aware of who would care most about these claims and the pressure that many Mormon scholars and leaders face to put forth a faith-promoting perspective. And through his approach, Quinn pushed the field of Mormon history towards new issues and interpretations while simultaneously ensuring that scholars can't adequately address certain topics without at least responding to his sources, if not engaging directly with his interpretations. And so next, I want to take a closer look at Quinn's analysis of the secret Nauvoo organization that had spiritual and institutional implications and was the only priesthood quorum to include both men and women, the anointed quorum. In Origins of Power, Quinn builds upon portions of at least two of his earlier articles, the 1979 article, Latter-day Saint Prayer Circles, and the 1992 article, Mormon Women Have Had the Priesthood Since 1843. While previously Quinn didn't identify the anointed quorum as having any role in church government, his understanding developed over the years. Joseph Smith began the quorum with a group of 9 men in 1842, but expanded the quorum to include more men and then women in September of 1843. With the inclusion of women, Smith introduced the second anointing or fullness of the priesthood, which he and Emma were the first couple to receive. Quinn argues that Joseph linked the second anointing ordinance with theocratic powers, and then the men and women who received the second anointing were endowed with theocratic powers, and by the end of 1843, the anointed quorum became a forum for political strategy on behalf of the church on at least a limited basis. Quinn's analysis gives new insight into the role of both the anointed quorum and Emma Smith specifically in the succession crisis. When Joseph and Hiram were murdered in June of 1844, hundreds of men, including 3/4 of the apostles, were away from Nauvoo on a political mission to help elect Joseph Smith as president of the United States. In part because his brother Hiram died with him, Joseph died without a clear successor, and he had indicated a number of possibilities for succession without establishing a clear priority of the possibilities. Before the return of Brigham Young and other apostles in early August, the anointed quorum, which had no requirement for a majority to be present to conduct business, became the primary venue for discussions of succession. Within the quorum, Emma put forth her preference for William Marks, stake president and president of the High Council, to assume leadership of the church. Marks, like Emma, opposed the practice of plural marriage. In a series of meetings in July, Emma argued on behalf of Marks, but was ultimately outvoted and outmaneuvered by members of the quorum who were unwilling to either appoint someone opposed to plural marriage or who wanted to wait until the arrival of the apostles before settling the matter. In Mormon Enigma, Emma's biographers Linda King Newell and Valley Tippett Avery discuss Emma's meetings in July of 1844 and her arguments in favor of Marks. But in Origins of Power, Quinn places Emma's actions specifically in the context as a member of the anointed quorum. She's not only acting as the prophet's widow, but as a member of an organization that was unknown to the general membership of the church, but wherein she had received the highest order of priesthood. After Brigham Young returns to Nauvoo in early August and functionally takes the leadership of the church as the president of the quorum of the 12 apostles, Emma no longer participates in the anointed quorum. So while challenges to Brigham's succession continued for months and years to come, Quinn shows that there was a short window of time which Emma sought to use her power and influence as a member of the anointed quorum to shape the direction of the church after her husband's death. Origins of Power received many reviews, and while generally reviewers recognized that this was an impressive and significant work within Mormon history, Reviewers also at times came to entirely opposite conclusions as one another, highlighting some of the tensions within Mormon studies and in the broader field of American religious history. For instance, there was a question of, did origins of power reflect a faithful LDS perspective? This question was significant in the 1990s because of a growing body of publication in the previous decades that became known as the New Mormon History, which of course is also the title of an anthology that Quinn himself edited and published in 1992. Mormon studies scholars were participating in similar trends to the larger field of academic history by asking new questions about power structures, engaging new primary sources, and including perspectives of individuals who may previously have been marginalized in the narrative, including gender, racial, and sexual minorities. Mormon studies scholars who were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints faced additional tensions in the process of writing revisionist history, as their work could lead to an end of their employment by the church, or in some cases, church discipline and excommunication. So in the reviews of Origins of Power, the question of whether the text reflected a faithful LDS perspective reflected some of those anxieties. One LDS scholar found Quinn to have decentered the Mormon story. He wrote, Quinn's studies have been influenced by Michael Foucault's work and tend to overemphasize raw administrative power, such as its use of violence and extended marriage relationships to maintain and expand its control. His scholarship, while important, tends to move the Mormon story to the peripheral areas, such as criminal behavior, gender issues, and the folk beliefs of the membership. For this reviewer, issues of power dynamics, gender, and folk beliefs were not the preferred Mormon story, but were periphery. For another reviewer, Quinn unreflectively and uncritically employs an insider's understanding. History thereby gets mixed with and informed by an implicitly LDS faith-based viewpoint. So for this reviewer,
Oh shoot, we were doing so well. I think she's almost done. What we'll do is we'll let her finish up her remarks, and then if you have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A area or the chat, and we'll try to work on those as soon as Katie comes back to us. Everybody fast, pray, pay your tithing. Let's hope that it works. Shoot. Someone's asking about the presentations being available later on. They will, Willie, do you want to talk about that really quick? Oh, there's Katie. Let's let her finish up first.
I am so sorry. Okay, so I'll jump to my final concluding paragraph. I'm not sure how much got cut off at the end there, but for the sake of time. So in her memoir, Sojourner in a Promised Land, historian Jan Ships offers a significant insight. Mormonism, unlike other modern religions, is a faith cast in the form of history. And Ships argues that the new Mormon history laid forth by Juanita Brooks and Leonard Arrington essentially set the pattern for a more academic approach to Mormon history. But it seems to me that that previous notion inside Mormon studies that any profane or secular investigation was like trespassing on forbidden ground was still alive and well in the 1990s for certain topics and historical claims. Quinn was not one to respect no trespassing signs if he believed historical sources led him to forbidden ground. Quinn paid a steep cost for his writings and his integrity to his interpretation of historical truth. But Mormon studies is undoubtedly better, its arguments sharper, and its engagement with primary sources more thorough because Quinn stayed in the game. Thank you. Sorry for my technical issues.
No, thank you so much, Katie. That was great. And thank you, Carrie and Ben. Fantastic. I just feel so honored to be here with all of you guys. I'll start my video again. Okay, so we're going to get in the question portion. Someone asked if this is going to be recorded. I'll have Willie talk more about that. But yes, it's going to be recorded. It is being recorded, and it's going to be up on YouTube so you can hear all of this. And you're welcome to ask questions in the comment section right now. Right now we have some questions. Tom Anderson asked, any word on Quinn's book in progress on polygamy? If any of you guys know, I have a potential answer, but does anyone want to field that question? I can just say what I know about it is Quinn has been doing some research on post-manifesto polygamous unions up until 1925. He's been doing research on that for a long time. We know that a few scholars who are concerned and interested in this research are in touch with family members, and the family intends to work with scholars. So we'll see where that's at. But we do know that Mike Quinn's papers are being donated. Ben, I always get this wrong. Is it at Yale?
Yeah, they're housed at the Beinecke, and I'll add two quick things. One, the Quinn collection at Yale at the Beinecke Library is probably the richest collection of 1980s and 1990s Mormonism anywhere. That collection is so rich. I mean, I think they have his voicemail cassettes from 1987 to 1993 to give you a sense of how exhaustive it is. And two, I don't know how many specific details I can give, but keep your eye out for some important publications from Signature next year related to Quinn.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. Yeah, Mike Quinn was an interesting man in the sense that he was very analog. So he kept everything, but anyone that knows him knows he would go to the library once a week, get on the computer once a week. He would answer emails once a week. That was kind of his MO. So, okay, we have a question. Did Quinn or other Mormon scholars think truth claims being true were requisite for one to engage meaningfully in Mormonism's practice? Does anyone want to field that question? No?
I'll quickly say, I don't want to dominate the discussion, so I'll be quick. Quinn did not think you had to be a believer to engage Mormonism, but he did believe you needed to state where your biases were. So he was which put him in a pretty odd position, because as a revisionist in his term, he was often found outside of the official discourse, and yet his insistence that a writer needs to be upfront with their beliefs, that's actually a position that you typically find with apologists, which is just another example how Quinn never fits in our neat and tidy categories.
Yeah, and I would just add that what he said in his introduction of Origins of Power is that history can and should examine what people say about metaphysical experiences, but history can't demonstrate, prove, or disprove otherworldly interactions with human experience. So I think, like, from his perspective as a scholar, is he's not setting out to prove that, but wants to be upfront with his biases.
Okay, we have another question that I think is interesting. This is from Josh Devine. He says, Quinn appeared on KUTV's Take Two show with Rod Decker when Origins of Power was released. A BYU history professor appeared as well and argued that Quinn was too negative. Quinn replied essentially that too much of Mormon history is whitewashed and he was filling in the gaps or misrepresentations. What do you all think about the claims that Quinn was too negative?
I don't know that I can comment on all of his work, but from what I've read, one of the things he said in the same-sex dynamics was that he wasn't writing this to support anybody's point of view, that it was going to make everybody mad, that he didn't have a reason to champion one view or the other view. There's just the text. There is what we have. There are the letters, there are the documents that are left, and he was very committed in the book to just presenting them and not looking further into them than a lot of people would want. One of the criticisms that I read of his book was that he really should have speculated, that there was reason to speculate more in what was there, but he was devoted to just saying, here is the record, and I'm going to refrain from commenting on it more. And I think one of the reasons he did that was because clearly there was such a negative reaction from the Mormon end of things that said, you have an agenda, you are a homosexual apologist, you are trying to push us to believe something we don't want to believe. And then there was the other end that was like, listen, we are looking at these texts and they are so queer. Just say that they're queer, just say it. And he wouldn't. He was committed to just saying, no, here's the letter, make of it what you will. One of my favorite reviews actually was this scathing review from somebody at Farms. And he said that he never says that this queer thing happens, but because he doesn't say it, I believe that he is implying it even harder. And like, he was so mad because he was just like, the absence of an argument is the argument. And I think that really sort of sums up Quinn in a lot of ways, or at least my experience of Quinn, is that he says, here is a vast amount of scholarship, make of it what you will. And people bring to that all sorts of feelings.
Yeah, I would add, so I didn't get to read this part because I kept cutting out, but there was a reviewer who said that compared Quinn's focus on the messy parts of Mormon history to using the sweepings of the outhouse to define the palace. And I think, you know, how do you define what the palace is? What is the palace? And is that only the experience of the men who maintained the most power? Because are the sweepings of the outhouse the experience of people who experience power struggles in a very different way, the people whose experiences are left out of the dominant narrative? And anytime you bring in people who are hurt in this process, like, is that the sweepings of the outhouse? So I think that there's this value in extending the narrative to include the experiences of people who were not the dominant leaders, the ones who hold the most power, and that left a lot of people really uncomfortable. But I think that's also just part of the process that like broader academic history was going through in those decades.
And do you want to speak on negativity at all? Okay. This is a question from Gregory Brooks. He says, how has the scholarship on same-sex dynamics among 19th century individuals, especially Mormons, continued into the present? Quinn wasn't the last word, I'm sure, but I'm curious about how his legacy has impacted scholarship on those topics since that publication. Carrie, do you want to take that?
I can try. I'm not a queer scholar, so I am not familiar with everything that has been written. I'm just queer, not queer. I'm a queer scholar, but not a scholar anyway. So one of the things that I read recently was a book about female Victorian friendship that reminded me quite a lot. I kept thinking of it as I was reading Quinn's book. And I don't know that there has been a vast amount of scholarship about Mormons in particular. I think one of the arguments that Quinn made was a very good argument, which was that Mormons were really not that different. They are an example of what it was like to live in the 19th century, who are unique and interesting mainly because they just kept so many records. They just obsessively kept records, as Mormons do. And because of that, they just gives an example of what was already there. And even in Quinn's book, you can see him often like taking the Mormonettes and then comparing them to things like Oscar Wilde's trial for sodomy, or things that were happening with Susan B. Anthony, or different sorts of things that are going on in the country at large. So I know that of the things that I've read, it's largely held up the view of the 19th century as a homocultural, homo-emotional time. A time that had very complex experiences of friendship and love, and a very different way of approaching same-sex relationships than we do now, has held up. And I think, I can't say for sure that the current scholarship was inspired by Quinn, but it certainly has not diverted far from it.
I don't know if anyone wants to speak to this, but I can say that I know Connell O'Donovan's work excavating sort of marginalized stories from the past has also referenced Quinn's work. And I'm thinking of like Seth Anderson did a history of HIV in Utah, which is a book that you can pick up that also builds on it. So just from my own anecdotal experience, I've seen scholars build on his work. Does anyone else want to speak to that? Okay, we can go. Again, I would recommend picking up this book. It's really phenomenal, and Carrie's done a really good job sort of giving you some of the things to focus on. Okay, we've got more questions coming in. We'll take a few more. Catherine Sorber, I can never say your name, Catherine. She said, did Quinn have a written testimony of Mormonism toward the end of his life, besides the one magical worldview? This is a question that comes up a lot, the idea that Mike Quinn was still a believer in Mormonism. Does anyone want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'll say very quickly, I think the best source on his latter beliefs is his memoir. He wrote a very, very large memoir that he completed a full draft around 1998, and then he'd been tinkering with it until his death. And in his memoir, you'll find is pretty explicit remaining belief. And there are other places where you can find it recently. When his third volume of Mormon Hierarchy came out a few years ago, he did a series of interviews, and he was still pretty straightforward in those interviews that he remained a literalistic believer in Mormonism. And so you have those pieces there. You have pieces in his writings, his classic article on being a Mormon historian, and its aftermath goes into his private beliefs, but I think his memoir is probably going to be his last word on where he stood in terms of belief.
So Jeff Toon is asking, can one of you clarify the moment or the justifications used for removing the priesthood from women? It's a big question. Anyone succinctly answer that?
No.
I'll very quickly just point to recent scholarship. Jonathan Stapley has a wonderful book on Mormon priesthood that I strongly recommend. And then he, along with Chris Wright, wrote a fabulous article on Mormon women and the priesthood. And their answer to that question, very fraught, very complicated, very important question, is that it actually requires a redefinition of priesthood, and that our common perception of what priesthood is doesn't map on to early Mormon belief and practice. So when we're saying were Mormon women ordained to the priesthood, it depends on, are you talking about an ecclesiastical priesthood which dominates our lexicon today, or are we talking about the cosmological priesthood, which is the term that Stapley and Wright use, which was more in practice in the early period. And that's so I would recommend the article by Jonathan Stapley and Christine Wright on that topic.
Okay, a question for Ben Park. Do you feel like the revision of Magic Worldview is better than the first edition? Meaning, does it improve the overall thesis? Does it make it more complicated?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bob. I think it's hard to say whether his argument or thesis improved, because as I hinted in my remarks, the book didn't really have a thesis in the first place. And the revised version didn't really have a thesis either. Beyond that, magic and religion were intertwined in early Mormon beliefs, but most scholars would say that you typically have a thesis more. And this is a common issue with Quinn's work more generally, which Carrie has mentioned and Katie has kind of mentioned a bit on the side, that he saw himself as providing documents and evidence and facts. And in fact, in one of the introductions to Mormon hierarchy, I think Origins of Power, he specifically says, I refrain from making an argument in this book. Rather, I'm just providing the material for other historians to make an argument, which is I'll call it a rare approach to academic history. But as a result, the revisions to Magic Worldview, there wasn't much of a change to his thesis because there wasn't a thesis in the first place. Instead, he's adding, he adds a bit more evidence. He kind of uses recent historiographical publications to reaffirm or validate his earlier arguments. And then much of it is just, fighting with his critics and polemicists and responding to critiques of the book. So I would say the book becomes more important as a portrait of 1990s Mormonism, but the book probably doesn't improve much when it comes to capturing and engaging the religious worldview of early Mormons.
And I just want to point to Dan Vogel's work too, if you're interested in the topic. Dan Vogel has some great writings on early Mormon documents that kind of expound on Quinn's stuff. Okay, I'm going to ask two more questions and then we can wrap this up. Really quick though, Ben, can you tell us the title of the memoir?
I cannot, because I can't remember it, but I'll just say, keep your eyes out at some point in the future. How's that for a general abstract statement? Perfect.
Okay. So I'm just going to kind of combine Ryan Wimmer and Becky Smith's question because it's about Mike Quinn's relationship to the institution. Ryan Wimmer wants to know if his excommunication was due to his research or sexual orientation. That's a pretty big question, Ryan. And Becky asks, did he have a close or warm friendship with any general authorities? Does anyone want to speak to Mike's history with the institution itself, which is it could be its own conference?
I mean, I could speak as somebody who was queer who taught at BYU for a long time. I would say, from what I understand, he was not officially excommunicated because he was gay. It was not because of his sexual orientation. It was because of his publications, they said, because he said things that made the church upset. And I think that's true. As somebody who was queer in that environment, I have to say though that part of the reason you get into trouble is because they don't like you to begin with, and maybe you're not out, and maybe they don't know why they don't like you, but everything you say bothers them. So I that would be my experience. So I think officially he did not get excommunicated because of his orientation. He got excommunicated because of his scholarship. Unofficially, implicitly, I don't know. I think that's a different question.
And I'll just add to that. I think Carrie's dead on that. He would have been in hot water regardless of his sexuality, given the scholarship that's coming out. I mean, his publication on Post-Manifesto Polygamy got him in enough trouble in 1985 to where if he had a different stake present at the time, that crisis might have come to a head 8 years earlier than it did. And then, as many of you know, when he was excommunicated in September of 1993, he was not the only person excommunicated that month. And the others who were excommunicated or disciplined were disciplined because of their writings and their actions and not their sexuality. But I do think it played a role. And Quinn actually talks about in some of his published writings. And the memoir, sorry if I wasn't clear before, the memoir is unpublished at this moment. It is in the hands of the Smith-Pettit Foundation. He had enough hints from leadership, even though he was not open about his homosexuality, that it was becoming an open secret. And so you can't say that it didn't play a role. And on the question of did he have warm relationships with any general authorities, he didn't. And I think that was a key part, because I imagine many of you have read Terrell Givens's new biography of Eugene England. And one of the things that strikes a reader when approaching that book is how close Eugene England was to a number of general authorities. And that probably saved him from a lot of actions that D. Michael Quinn didn't. That because Quinn did not have those close relationships with general authorities, he couldn't fall back on any defenders when he got in trouble.
Okay, perfect. Peter, I had a question, but I can't find it now. I'm going to, sorry, Peter, if this is not what you're saying, but this is a good question to end on, and I want to hear all of your opinions. Basically, the thrust, I think, of his question was, you know, the temperature of Mormon studies when Quinn was publishing was very fraught. There was a lot of political things going on behind the scenes. Do you think that has changed, and how has Mike Quinn's work changed, if at all, the temperature and politics of publishing in Mormon studies? Katie, do you want to start with that? And we'll just kind of like go around the room.
Yeah, well, from Ben, Ben gave a lecture last year talking about one of his upcoming books. And remember, like, there are waves of, I think, tensions and retrenchment in Mormon history. And often that plays out at BYU. Like, BYU becomes the grounds where you see retrenchment, and then you see a warming to what I would maybe consider a more expansive academic publishing. But I think it goes in waves, and I think there are indications that there are areas of publishing that are less welcomed at the moment. And I will pause there to not name individuals who might not want to be named at the moment.
I can only speak to my own experience with any sort of publishing. I'm not in Mormon studies per se, but I do know that the things that I was allowed to say when I taught at BYU are vastly different from the things that I've been able to say since leaving the church in entirety. There's just no comparison. Like the pressures that are placed on you to not speak are very, very firm, and I feel like they've only gotten stronger. I don't know what it's like to be a Mormon scholar who is not at BYU, and I also don't want to know what it's like exactly to even be in Mormon studies and part of the church. But I do know there is a vast difference between what you can say in the church versus what you cannot say when you're in the church, and how much it changes after you leave.
In 2012 or 14, I forget the exact year, a wonderful writer by the name of David Haglund wrote an essay for Slate on D. Michael Quinn. And he used it to talk about Mormon culture and how Mormon leaders were uncomfortable with an unvarnished approach to the past. And I remember when it came out, a lot of people, including myself, thought that the essay was very smart, very important, but overstated the frosty nature of academics versus leadership in the church, and that was actually an embodiment of a bygone era. And I, at the time, even wrote an essay on how the Quinn story is a reminder of how far we've come since then. Thinking about that 7 years later now, just reaffirms what Katie brought up, the cyclical nature, that I don't feel like we're in the same place as we were 7 years ago with Mormon scholarship. If anything, I feel like there's a bit of a retrenchment going on, and I could point to a number of specific examples. I don't know how long that'll last. If there's any lesson that we take from Mormon history, it's that any current mood can be both temporary and long-lasting. It probably reflects the current anxieties of people at the very top of the hierarchy. And as Quinn's own scholarship demonstrates, and this would be a good point for me to bow out, as Quinn's own scholarship demonstrates, is there are personalities and circumstances that are constantly evolving and changing. And so while it's important for historians to give a roadmap of how we got to this point now, it would be foolish for us to try to envision where we're going to go from here.
All right, well, thank you again to all these incredible thinkers and scholars that have agreed to do this panel. I'm very, very thrilled that you joined me on this. It's fantastic. And again, happy birthday, Ben. Remember the Quinn conference coming up in March, more to follow on that. Carrie's book is also coming out next year, and we're going to be seeing a lot more from Katie as well. And just as a reminder, we're going to be doing another event like this on October 2nd with Taylor Petrie about his phenomenal book. So I hope to see you all there. We really appreciate the turnout today and the support. And of course, you can follow these folks on social media and get good takes on things. So on behalf of Sunstone, thank you for supporting us. Thank you for supporting our events and our organization and Utah Humanities. Special thanks to Willie for these incredible events.
Awesome. A recording will be available on the Utah Humanities YouTube channel, and you can keep an eye on our social media for that coming up. Hopefully within the next week. I will have to edit bits, especially to just make some of the technological challenges less challenging in the recording. But y'all have a great Saturday evening. It's been such a blessing to be able to share this space with y'all, and I hope to keep working with Sunstone. This has been amazing. Yeah, have a great Saturday. Take care.